I'm going to show you a very basic technique of making paper mache. Unlike how we normally imagine paper mache, which is either newspaper laid over balloons in primary school or a kind of egg box texture. This is actually a very fine, it can be transparent, translucent shell, more akin to some of the traditional Japanese paper structures than egg boxes or anything crude like that. So it can be quite crispy, and the surface can be very smooth. This has just come straight off the mould, but if that was sanded, you can get a really fine finish on it. And depending on what you use as a support underneath, it can either be part of your model making, or it can be the final piece or a model of a final piece. And because it's mainly paper, it cuts nicely and glues, and you can do all sorts of things with it. There are a couple of things that you need to bear in mind when you're choosing something to work over, and that is that the paper shrinks. So if you're doing a shape that has a concave in it, it will pull up unless you somehow hold it down. And I've made shapes where I've bound the material while it's still wet, so that when it shrinks it can't web up. The form I'm going to use today is this black plastic shape, and to prepare it I've done something that I do quite frequently, which is to cover it with a cling film. It stops any water damage on the thing that you're moulding over, but also it helps act as a release so that you don't accidentally glue your paper to what you're modelling it on. You also need some PVA, and if you can get crisp PVA so that it dries hard, that's better than the one that you can get that dries slightly rubbery, just because the harder the glue when it dries, the crispier your shell. You need some water, and you also need tissue paper, and this is just ordinary tissue paper that I've just cut up into kind of inch wide, 3-inch long pieces, which is a nice size to handle. A mixing bowl and a stick, because I generally try and keep everything as neat as possible. I don't like getting glue everywhere. It's a relatively slow process. It has to be built up in layers because the glue requires evaporation. So if you're wanting to speed it up, you can put it on a warm place, but the more layers you do, the longer it takes to dry out. If you don't mix the glue with water, then you can't drag your piece of paper through it. It needs to be of a consistency where you can coat it. And if you make it too wet, then the paper disintegrates. The secret to good paper mache is that the glue has to go through the paper so that it actually penetrates the fibres of the paper. And rubbing it in the glue helps, but also just rubbing it over, massaging it down, all helps to bring the glue to the surface of the paper. I'll probably only do a couple of layers and then let it dry and then work another couple of layers. It generally goes, I find, particularly if I've got 2 or 3 pieces that I'm working on at the same time, it tends to go just as quick to do that than to do lots of layers and then letting it dry all at once. There are a couple of advantages to that, one of which is you need, well, it's probably worth doing test pieces, but I would say you need 5-6 layers at an absolute minimum. If you can imagine, that's just 5 or 6 layers of tissue paper, which is really thin. So certainly if you're after something structural, you'll need to be going 10 layers, something like that. And you need to make sure that there are no air bubbles in between the layers. Drying them out in between each layer also helps you identify that you're coating them evenly and that you're not building up in one place or missing any places. So I'm going to let that dry now and then do another couple of layers on it.